Welcome to the Fluent English podcast. Today, we'll be exploring the world of weather forecasts, from like the basics to some of the more advanced terms and ideas. Sit back and enjoy. It's kind of wild how much we actually rely on these predictions in our lives, right? It's everything from like quickly checking our phone to see if we need an umbrella to, huge industries that plan their entire operations based on the weather.
It really is something
Yeah.
that's constantly there in the background influencing our lives.
Yeah.
We make so many choices, big and small, just based on if we think it'll rain or if it'll be sunny or if it'll be cold or hot. And what's really amazing is how much complicated science goes into making those predictions,
Yeah.
which seems so simple on the surface.
Yeah, totally. Like it's super easy to just not even think about it and just look at that little icon on our phone that shows a sun or a cloud. But there's actually a ton of effort and a ton of information that goes into making that little icon. So what exactly does go into making a weather forecast? Because it's got to be more than just someone making a guess, right?
Oh, way more. It's a whole process. Meteorologists use all these really sophisticated tools and scientific data. Imagine, like, putting together a puzzle, but the pieces are coming from weather stations, like the ones you see around, and also from satellites way up in space, and even weather balloons that they send high up into the atmosphere. Each of these gives them a unique and really important piece of the picture.
Okay, so let's break it down a bit. Like, start with the basics. What does a weather forecast actually tell us? We obviously all know, like, will it be hot or cold, rainy or dry? But what else is there? What's the scope of all this weather info?
So at its core, a weather forecast is all about predicting what the atmosphere is going to do, right? This includes stuff like different types of precipitation, whether we're talking about rain, snow, sleet, or hail. And it also includes how much cloud cover there will be, like if it's clear, cloudy, partly cloudy, but it also goes deeper than that. They also predict the temperature, how windy it'll be, and even which direction the wind will blow. And all this helps us get ready for what's coming.
And that being prepared part is really important, right? It's not just about being comfy. It's about making smart choices that impact our day or even our plans weeks or months down the road.
Definitely. Whether it's just figuring out what to wear today or planning a big outdoor event weeks in advance, the forecast gives us the info we need. It helps us be proactive instead of just reacting to whatever the weather decides to do.
So let's dig into those data sources you mentioned earlier. Let's start with weather stations. Those are the ones we see around, right? What kind of info are they giving us that's so essential for forecasting?
So think of them as like little checkup points for the atmosphere,
Yeah.
constantly taking its pulse. They're set up all over the world, and they're continuously measuring these basic things, but they're really important. They measure stuff like temperature, how much moisture is in the air, that's called humidity. They track those little changes in air pressure and how fast the wind's blowing and what direction it's coming from. And the cool thing is, even though this seems like local on-the-ground info, it's actually the foundation for all those bigger predictions, for entire regions or even the whole country. They act like a reality check for those huge computer models.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like having this network of sensors that are super sensitive, just constantly feeding info back into the system. And then we have satellites, which are obviously way up in space. What's their unique perspective? What do they bring to the table that the ground stations can't?
Satellites offer a view that you just can't get from down here. From up there, they have this continuous wide view of what's happening in the Earth's atmosphere, and they can see these huge weather systems developing. So they can see the big picture stuff like a hurricane forming over the ocean or massive cloud formations stretching across entire continents.
So they're like the early warning system for those big, significant weather events.
Exactly. They can watch those massive systems move, how intense they're getting, and that gives them important because they give us data from places where we don't have many weather stations on the ground, like remote areas. So they fill in the gaps and give us this more complete view of what's going on with the weather all over the planet.
And what about those weather balloons? I know they go super high up into the atmosphere. What special insights do they give that we can't get from the satellites or ground stations?
So those weather balloons are pretty cool. They carry these little packages of instruments called radiosones, and as they go up, up, up into the atmosphere, they measure things like temperature, humidity, and air pressure at all these different heights. It's like getting a vertical slice of the atmosphere, and that's super important for figuring out how stable the atmosphere is. And that stability thing is what helps predict things like thunderstorms forming, or if a big chunk of cold air, we call that a cold front, is about to move in.
So it's not just about what's happening on the ground or what we see from space. It's about understanding how the entire atmosphere is behaving from top to bottom. Now, when we hear the temperature in the forecast, they always mention the highs and lows for the day. What's the significance of those? Why are those important?
Okay, so the high temperature, that's the warmest point we expect during the day, which usually happens in the afternoon when the sun's rays are the strongest. And then the low temperature is the opposite. It's the coolest point, which is usually overnight or right before sunrise when the Earth's been cooling down all night. And knowing this daily up and down of the temperature is really important for us, not just for deciding what to wear, but also for planning our activities. Like if there's a big difference between the high and low, say if it's a warm afternoon, but then it gets really chilly at night, that tells us we need to dress in layers so we can adjust.
Right. It's not just the number itself, but like you said, it's that range that's important for our comfort and how we plan things. And I know there are forecasts for different lengths of time, from a few hours to weeks or even months out. How does the accuracy change with those different time frames? Like, how reliable are they?
That's a great question. So those short-term forecasts, the ones that cover a few hours up to about 2 days, those are usually the most accurate because they're focused on weather systems that have already started to form and move. And they have lots of details, like they'll give you specific temperatures for different parts of the day, how likely it is to rain, details about the wind, and descriptions of the clouds. Yeah. So, you'll hear things like sunny by midday or showers developing this evening in those forecasts. These are the ones you want to check for making those everyday decisions. Now, the long-term forecasts, those are the ones that go out a week or even a month. Those are a bit trickier. The atmosphere is kind of chaotic, so it's harder to be super precise that far out. They give us more of a general idea of what might happen. So they might say something like temperatures will be warmer than average next month, or we expect less rain than usual this season. Those are helpful for making those big picture plans, like for farmers, or if you're booking a vacation a while in advance. But you definitely want to remember they might not be perfectly accurate. And it's good to check the shorter term forecasts as you get closer to the date. It actually highlights a really interesting point. Even with all our tech and science, perfect long-term weather prediction is still a big challenge. The atmosphere is just so complex.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's obviously way harder to predict what's going to happen a week out, let alone a month out, compared to just a few hours. And all this information, all these forecasts, ultimately they help us get ready for specific things in our lives, right?
You got it. If you're planning a hike this weekend, or maybe a big family picnic, the forecast helps you make adjustments and have backup plans if needed. It's all about being prepared so you can enjoy yourself and not get caught off guard by the weather. There's a long history of people using simple observations to figure out what the weather might do. Like way back in the day, they would track changes in air pressure to predict if storms were coming or if the weather was going to clear up. That just shows how important this information has always been for people.
So the big takeaway here is this. Weather forecast, it's a prediction based on science. It uses all this data from different sources, and then it uses really complex analysis to help us live our lives and plan for the future. But like you said, the further out we try to predict, the harder it gets to be totally accurate because the atmosphere is just so complex and unpredictable.
Okay, so we've talked about what goes into a forecast and what kind of info it gives us, but how do the experts, the meteorologists, actually take all that data and turn it into a prediction that we can use.
Now that's where the science gets really interesting. It combines tools that can actually observe the weather with complex ways of analyzing the data. One of the most important tools is weather radar, which we've all probably seen on TV at some point.
Right, those maps with all the colors that show where the rain or snow is. But what is radar actually telling us? What's going on there? So weather radar, its main job is to detect precipitation, which is any form of water that falls from the sky. So we're talking rain, snow, sleet, and hail. It's super important for tracking those really intense storms like thunderstorms, and it can even give us clues about whether a tornado might be forming.
But how does it see the rain or snow? How does it detect those particles in the air?
Okay, so radar works by sending out these pulses of radio waves. The waves travel through the air, and when they hit something like water droplets or ice crystals, which is what rain and snow are made of, a little bit of that wave bounces back to the radar. And by analyzing how long it takes for the signal to come back, how strong the signal is, and even how the frequency of the wave changed, meteorologists can tell where the precipitation is, how heavy it is, and even how fast it's moving.
Oh, wow. So those maps we see, those are showing us where the rain or snow is happening right now and how much is falling, all based on these radio waves bouncing back to the radar.
Exactly. And that info is really important for getting warnings out quickly. Like if there's going to be a lot of rain or if a thunderstorm is heading our way.
Yeah.
And it's especially important for tracking those dangerous types of weather.
We talked earlier about how satellites give us this big overall picture of the weather. But what's their specific role in the more detailed, nitty-gritty part of making the forecast?
So besides giving us that wide view, weather satellites are constantly gathering tons of data about what's going on in the atmosphere. Like they take really detailed pictures of clouds at different heights, they measure the temperature of the surface of the ocean, and they even collect information about temperature and moisture at different levels of the atmosphere.
Right.
And all this data gets fed into these super complicated computer models.
So they're not just taking pretty pictures, they're actually collecting real data that's used to make those predictions?
Totally. They're essential because they give the models this starting point, this initial condition for all their calculations, especially for areas where we don't have a lot of ground stations, like over the oceans.
And you mentioned these computer models. It sounds like they're the real powerhouse of weather forecasting. How do they work? What's the magic behind them?
You can think of them as incredibly detailed simulations of the Earth's atmosphere. They take in huge amounts of data from all those sources we talked about, the weather stations, satellites, radar, and balloons. And then they have these algorithms, which are basically sets of instructions that use the laws of physics, how the atmosphere actually works, to calculate how things like temperature, pressure, wind, and moisture will change over time.
So it's like creating a digital copy of the atmosphere and then letting it run to see what will happen in the future?
Yeah. That's a good way to think about it. These models are what allow us to make those big predictions, like what the weather will be across a whole continent. And they can also simulate how big storms might develop and move and how strong they might get, which helps us send out those important warnings. But it's important to remember that these models are just simulations, right? They're incredibly complex. But they can't perfectly predict the future, especially very far out. That's why those long-range forecasts aren't always spot on. But the scientists who work on these models, they're always trying to improve them and make them more accurate.
And those weather balloons we were talking about, how does that special vertical data they collect get used in these models?
That data is super valuable because it tells us what the upper atmosphere is like, the temperature, humidity, and wind at different heights. They get plugged right into the models, and that gives them a much more complete and accurate starting point for their simulations. Like, knowing how the temperature changes as you go higher in the atmosphere is crucial for predicting things like thunderstorms.
And you said that we have this global network of weather stations. How does having so many of them actually improve the forecasts?
The more weather stations we have, the better we understand what's happening right now on the ground all over the world. This gives those computer models a super detailed picture to start with, and that can make those short-term forecasts, the ones for the next few hours or days, even more accurate. And it's especially important for those localized events, like if a storm is going to hit a specific town. And another big advantage is that all this data is shared instantly between countries through these international networks.
And then there are supercomputers. It sounds like you need some serious computing power to crunch all this data and run those really complex models, right?
Sure. Just imagine the amount of data coming in from all those different sources, weather stations, satellites, radar, and balloons. It's massive. And then those models, with all their calculations, they need a ton of computing power to run. That's where supercomputers come in. They're essential for getting the forecast out to us quickly and for testing and improving those models.
It's amazing to think how much technology is behind something that we often just take for granted, like checking the weather app on our phone. You also mentioned historical weather data. Why is it useful to look back at past weather events? How does that help predict the future?
It's all about finding patterns. By looking at old weather records, meteorologists can spot things that happen over and over again in certain places at certain times of year. Like, let's say we know that a particular city usually gets most of its rain in June. That helps us make a more informed prediction about what might happen in June this year. It's not foolproof, but it's another way to make those forecasts a bit more accurate.
So it's like learning from history, right? Seeing what happened in the past to get a better idea of what might happen again. It sounds like weather forecasting is this really cool blend of technology and science. You've got these advanced tools and then this deep understanding of how the atmosphere works, and then you're also using historical analysis.
It's really a constant process of observing, analyzing, and then tweaking those models to try to get better and better at predicting the weather. But even once those forecasts are made, we need to be able to understand what they're actually saying, right? That's where knowing the specific terms they use comes in.
Yeah, totally. Like if we don't know what those words mean, we can't really understand the forecast or make good decisions based on it. So let's start with temperature again. We've talked about Celsius and Fahrenheit, but what about those high and low temperatures we see in the forecast?
So remember we talked about the high being the warmest point of the day, usually in the afternoon, and the low being the coolest point, usually overnight. Well, when you see those in the forecast, that's what they're referring to. So, for example, if the forecast says high of 22 Celsius, low of 12 Celsius, that tells us it'll be a mild day, but it'll cool down quite a bit at night. So maybe bring a light jacket.
Okay, that makes sense. And then we have precipitation, which seems to have a whole vocabulary of its own.
Right. Precipitation is the general term for any water that falls from the sky to the ground. So that includes rain, which is just liquid water droplets, snow, which is those frozen water crystals we see when it's cold, sleet, which is kind of a mix of rain and snow, often little ice pellets, and then hail, which are those chunks of ice that usually fall during really intense thunderstorms.
And a lot of times they'll give us a chance of rain as a percentage or even a specific amount of rain they expect. How do we make sense of those numbers? What do they mean for us?
Okay, so if the forecast says 40% chance of rain, that means there's a 40% probability that it will rain at any point within the area covered by that forecast. It doesn't tell you exactly where or when it'll rain, just the overall likelihood. And then if they say something like 10 millimeters of rainfall, that's telling you how much they think will fall. So if it's just a little bit, maybe you just need an umbrella. But if they're expecting a lot of rain, maybe you'll want to wear boots or even change your plans.
What about humidity? We hear that a lot, especially when they talk about how hot or cold the temperature feels. What exactly is humidity?
Humidity is all about how much water vapor is in the air. The more water vapor, the more humid it feels. And we often hear about relative humidity, which is given as a percentage. So 100% relative humidity means the air is completely saturated with water vapor and can't hold anymore. That usually happens right before it rains. High humidity makes it harder for our sweat to evaporate, which is how our body cools down, so it makes hot temperatures feel even hotter. That's why they often give you a feels-like temperature, which takes into account both the actual temperature and the humidity.
So it could be 30 degrees Celsius, but with high humidity, it might actually feel like 35 degrees, which is way more uncomfortable.
Exactly. And then on the flip side, when the humidity is low, the air feels drier. And that can actually make cold temperatures feel even colder.
Let's talk about clouds now. I know there are specific words they use to describe how cloudy it is.
Yeah, so the simplest one is clear, which means there are no clouds in the sky. Then you have partly cloudy, which means there are some clouds, but there's still a lot of blue sky and sunshine. Mostly cloudy is the opposite, so more clouds than clear sky. And then overcast means the entire sky is covered with clouds, usually making it look gray.
So, if the forecast says mostly cloudy with a chance of light rain in the evening, we can kind of picture what the day will be like, right? What about wind? I know they give wind speeds, and sometimes they mention gusts too. What does all that mean?
Right, so wind speed tells you how fast the air is moving, usually in kilometers per hour or miles per hour. And they'll also use words to describe it like light winds are gentle, moderate winds are more noticeable, and strong winds can actually make it hard to walk or even blow things over. And those gusts, those are those sudden bursts of stronger wind that you sometimes feel. So a forecast might say something like winds 25 kilometers per hour, gusting to 40, which means the wind will mostly be blowing at 25, but there could be times when it suddenly jumps up to 40.
That makes sense. And finally, we have barometric pressure, which I know has something to do with whether it's stormy or clear. What's the connection there?
So barometric pressure, or just air pressure, is basically the weight of all the air above us. And it's a really important indicator of what the weather's going to do. When the pressure is low, that usually means the air is rising, which can lead to clouds forming and precipitation, including storms. But when the pressure is high, that means the air is sinking, which makes it harder for clouds to form. So you usually end up with clear, sunny weather. So, if the forecast says something like a low pressure system is approaching, that's often a sign that rain or storms are on the way. Understanding all these terms and how they relate to each other really helps you understand those weather forecasts better and have more informed conversations about the weather.
Totally. It's like learning a secret code so you can unlock all the secrets the weather is trying to tell us. Now, I know there are different types of forecasts, like some cover just a few hours, some go out for a week, and some even look months ahead. Do they have different names or categories?
Yeah, definitely. Weather forecasts are designed to give us different levels of detail and to serve different purposes depending on how far out we're looking. So we have those short-term, medium-term, and long-term forecasts. And then there are also those really important severe weather alerts that go out when there's danger.
Let's talk more about those short-term forecasts. You mentioned earlier that they're the most accurate. What are the main things that set them apart?
So short-term forecasts, they're all about what's happening right now and what's likely to happen over the next couple of days, usually up to 48 hours. They're super detailed because they're focused on weather systems that are already in motion. So it gets specific temperatures for different times of the day, the exact chance of rain, detailed info about the wind and what the clouds will be like. And they often use phrases like sunny by midday or showers developing this evening. Those are the forecasts you want to check if you're making decisions about what to wear or if you're going to go for a walk or have lunch outside.
And what about those medium-term forecasts? How are they different?
So those usually cover a period of about 3 to 7 days. They're a bit broader in scope. They give you more of a general idea of what the weather will be like over the next week. So they'll talk about the general trend of the temperature, whether we expect a lot of rain or just a little, and any big weather patterns that might be coming through. So they might say something like, temperatures will be warming up over the weekend, or there's a chance of rain early next week. Yeah. They're not as precise as those short-term forecasts, but they're really useful if you're planning something a few days out, like if you're going on a trip or having a barbecue with friends.
Okay, so if I'm planning a little weekend getaway, I'd check that medium-term forecast. What about if I'm thinking even further ahead? What about those long-term outlooks? How far out do those go, and what kind of info do they give us?
So long-term forecasts can go out a few weeks or even a few months. But the further out we go, the harder it is to be precise. So these forecasts, they're all about trends and general patterns. They might say something like, we expect a warmer than average spring, or rainfall will be below normal this summer. They're helpful for those big picture decisions, like if you work in agriculture or if you're planning a vacation months in advance. But you always got to remember that they're not as reliable as those shorter term forecasts. So it's always a good idea to check the latest updates as you get closer to your dates.
Makes sense. And then we have those severe weather alerts. Those seem really important. When are those issued and what kind of info do they give?
So severe weather alerts are issued when there's a serious threat from the weather, something that could be dangerous. So we're talking things like tornadoes, hurricanes, blizzards, those really bad thunderstorms that have damaging winds or hail, and flash floods. These alerts tell you exactly what the threat is, where it's expected to hit, when it's likely to happen, how bad it could be, and most importantly, what you should do to stay safe. So if you hear something like tornado warning for your county or hurricane watch in effect for the coastal areas, you need to pay attention and take action.
Wow, okay. So it's really this multi-level system of forecasts, each one serving a different purpose. You've got those short-term ones for daily decisions, those medium-term ones for planning things a week out, and those long-term ones for the big picture, and then those severe weather alerts for when things get really serious.
Exactly. Using all the different types of forecasts together helps us get a really complete understanding of what the weather might do and helps us stay safe and prepared.
It's really interesting to think about how weather forecasts play such a big role in our lives. And it's not just about knowing whether to grab an umbrella or not. Why is it so important to understand the forecast in the bigger picture?
You hit the nail on the head. Weather forecasts, they're not just about convenience. They're really important for so many aspects of our lives. And it all starts with keeping people safe.
We've talked about those severe weather alerts, but how else do forecasts help protect people in general?
Think about hurricanes, which can be devastating. Those accurate forecasts give people time to evacuate, to secure their homes, to set up shelters. It can literally save lives. Same with tornado warnings. Those warnings give people precious minutes to find a safe place to take cover. And even something like a winter storm advisory, that can prevent accidents on the roads because people know to stay home or to drive extra carefully. The technology we have now has made a huge difference in how well we can predict these dangerous events, and that has definitely saved countless lives.
And even on a day-to-day basis, knowing the forecast just helps us live our lives more smoothly, right?
For sure. If we know it's going to rain, we can grab an umbrella or maybe decide to stay in and read a book instead of going for a walk. And knowing the temperature helps us choose what to wear so we're comfortable and don't get sick. It's all about being prepared so we can enjoy our day and not get caught off guard.
But the impact goes way beyond personal convenience, right? Like entire industries depend on those weather predictions.
Definitely. Think about agriculture. Farmers, they need to know what the weather's going to do so they can decide when to plant their crops, when to water them, and when to harvest them. And they need to protect their crops from bad weather, like frost or extreme heat. And then there's aviation. Pilots need to know about thunderstorms, wind, and visibility to make sure flights are safe. They use the forecast to avoid turbulence and to make sure they can land safely. And energy companies, they use forecasts to predict how much energy people will use for heating and cooling, and they also use it to make sure they can generate enough electricity from renewable sources like solar and wind power. And even the fashion industry relies on forecasts. They use it to design clothes that are appropriate for the expected weather. And of course, the tourism industry, They need to know what the weather will be like so they can plan the best times for people to visit and to make sure their outdoor events can go ahead. It's amazing how many different parts of the economy rely on weather forecasts.
It's also crucial for protecting the environment, right?
For sure. When we can predict how much rain is going to fall, it helps those water authorities manage those reservoirs and make sure there's enough water for everyone. And if we can forecast those extreme events like heat waves and floods, we can be better prepared and maybe even prevent some of the damage they cause, like wildfires or landslides. And those early warnings, they can help us protect those really sensitive ecosystems too.
And on that global level, looking at weather patterns all over the world, that helps us understand things like climate change, right?
Definitely. By watching and studying those global weather trends, we get a better understanding of how things like climate change are affecting the planet. And it also helps us understand those big climate patterns like El Nino and La Nina, which can have a huge impact on the weather in different parts of the world. And it's not just about understanding, it also helps countries work together to deal with those big natural disasters like droughts, hurricanes, and floods. They share info and resources so they can respond more effectively. So weather forecasts, they're not just about if it's going to rain tomorrow. They're about keeping people safe, making sure the economy is stable, protecting the environment, and just understanding our planet better.
Wow, that really puts it all into perspective. It's so much more than just checking the weather app. Now,
Yeah.
to sound more like a native English speaker when we're talking about the weather, there are a bunch of idioms and expressions we can use, right? Those are those phrases that don't literally mean what the words say, but they have a special meaning that everyone understands.
Absolutely. English has a ton of colorful expressions about the weather. For example, if someone says they're feeling under the weather, they don't actually mean they're standing out in the rain. It just means they're not feeling well.
Yeah, it's like a casual way to say you're a bit sick. What about a storm is brewing? Does that always mean there's a real storm coming?
Not necessarily. It's often used metaphorically,
Hmm.
to describe a situation where there's trouble or conflict on the horizon. Like if there's a lot of tension at work and people are arguing, you might say a storm is brewing.
I see. It's like you can sense that something bad is about to happen. Okay, what about this one? It's raining cats and dogs. That one's kind of funny.
It is.
Yeah,
That's just a very common way to say it's raining really hard, like a downpour.
I've heard that one a lot. How about make hay while the sun shines?
That's a proverb, piece of wisdom that people have been saying for a long time. It means you should take advantage of a good opportunity while you can. So if the weather's beautiful, you might say, let's make hay while the sun shines and go for a picnic or a hike.
Makes sense. What about every cloud has a silver lining?
Ah, that's a very optimistic saying. It means that even in difficult situations, there's usually something positive to be found.
What about the calm before the storm?
That one describes that period of peace and quiet that sometimes comes right before something really busy or intense happens.
And what about to break the ice? That's about conversations, right?
Right. It means to say or do something to ease tension and get a conversation going, especially when people are meeting for the first time.
How about throw caution to the wind?
That means to take a risk without thinking too much about the consequences.
And lightning never strikes twice.
That's a saying people use to reassure each other, to say that a bad thing is unlikely to happen again in the same way.
What about if something is a breeze?
That means it's super easy to do. Like you might say, that test was a breeze.
And finally, what about chasing the wind?
That describes trying to achieve something that's impossible or very difficult to get, like chasing after something that's always just out of reach. Learning these idioms and expressions is a great way to boost your English vocabulary and sound more natural when you're talking about the weather or even just everyday situations.
Yeah, they really make the language more colorful and interesting. Okay, so we've talked about the science behind weather forecasts, we've decoded all those weather terms, and we've even learned some fun idioms. Now let's get practical. What are some tips for actually listening to a weather forecast and getting the most useful info out of it? What should we be focusing on?
So to really get the most out of those forecasts, you got to be an active listener and pay attention to the details. First, always check that temperature range, the high and the low. That tells you how warm or cold the day will be overall. And like we said before, make sure you know if they're talking Celsius or Fahrenheit, because that makes a big difference.
Yeah, that's essential. What else should we look for?
So the next thing to check is that chance of precipitation. Remember, the higher the percentage, the more likely it is to rain or snow. Also, pay attention to how strong the wind will be and if they mention any gusts, because that can make a big difference in how warm or cold it feels. And think about the humidity too, because high humidity can make a warm day feel really muggy and uncomfortable. They often tell you the feels like temperature, which takes into account both the actual temperature and the humidity. So that's a good one to check.
Right, so it's not just the temperature itself, but how the wind and humidity make it feel on our skin. What else is important?
Always pay attention if they issue any special weather warnings or advisories. Those mean there's a potential danger, so you need to take them seriously and do what they say to stay safe. And if you have plans for a specific time of day, like if you're going for a run in the afternoon, it's a good idea to check those hourly forecasts. They'll give you a more detailed breakdown of how the weather might change throughout the day.
Yeah, that hourly breakdown can be super helpful if you want to try to avoid getting caught in a downpour. And what about those longer term forecasts? How should we approach those?
With those longer term forecasts, just remember that